Good evening. Thanks for coming out. This is wonderful, very, very wonderful turnout, very exciting. To talk a bit about the Pope's new encyclical, Deus Caritas Est, God is love. God is love. So what I'm going to do is I'll start by speaking a bit about what an encyclical is. And after that, I'll go through the major points of this encyclical. And then we'll have a little break at around 8 o'clock, and then we'll come back, and if there are any questions or comments or anything, so that at 8:30 we're done. Is that okay? Very good. So what is an encyclical? The word encyclical, it's an adjective, really. It's an encyclical letter. We just say an encyclical for short, an encyclical letter. And there's a word in encyclical, you see it, it's cycle, huh? So it's a circular letter. That's what it means. It's a bit like when you write your letter at Christmas that you photocopy and send to all your friends, right? That's like an encyclical letter that you're sending. It's a kind of a common letter that is sent to everyone. And in the early church, very early, bishops wrote encyclical letters. What they would do is write a letter to the bishops that lived around where they were, kind of letting them know what was going on in their own diocese and addressing some concerns, maybe sharing some insights that they had on some issues, or maybe some new discipline that they had developed in their church, so that by sharing that amongst the bishops, it allowed the bishops to share their wealth of ideas and of practices and everything. So it was a means of communication. I mean, we have to remember that, there was no telephone, there was no internet, there was no TV, there was no radio. So how did people communicate over distance? Was by writing. And if you wanted your letter to have a bit of impact, well, it was easier to kind of write a letter, a common letter, copy it a number of times, and have it distributed or sent out into the various areas. So they didn't call them encyclicals, but that's what they were. They were encyclicals. And eventually the Bishop of Rome kind of became the one who, he was the hub, A bishop would write a letter and send it to Rome, and from Rome it went out to others. So Rome kind of became the hub of a network of bishops from around the world who would write letters to each other. And then the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, started writing some himself. And this went on till the Middle Ages, and it died off during the Middle Ages. There stopped being encyclical letters that way. And the habit picked up again, and how do I know all this? It's because I've been reading this excellent book called The Encyclicals of John Paul II. And this, by the way, is edited by Father Michael Miller, who is a Canadian, from Ottawa originally, a Basilian father, who eventually spent most of his ministry as a Basilian father in the States and a bit of time in Rome, and recently has, just a year and a half ago he was named by the Pope as secretary to the Congregation for Education in Rome, which is one of the important congregations. So he was made a bishop, and so it's Bishop Michael Miller now. And he's working in Rome. And he wrote his doctoral thesis, on John Paul II's encyclicals up to that time, and then made a book. And this contains the first, 11 encyclicals of John Paul II, but he wrote a few more beyond that. At the beginning, Bishop Michael Miller starts by explaining some of what an encyclical is. And he's the one that points out that, let me see this, because I think it's an interesting little bit of Catholic trivia, you could say. Okay. Who is credited with reviving the ancient tradition of the Pope writing a common letter to a group of bishops or to all the bishops? It's a bishop who reigned from 1740 to 1758. Does anybody know which bishop was there between 1740 and 1758? His name was Benedict XIV. little coincidence there for you, huh? And But the ones who really started writing encyclicals started with Leo the 13th, who wrote many encyclicals, and he lists them here in the 20th century. Pius X wrote 16, Benedict XV wrote 12, Pius XI wrote 30, Pius XII wrote 41 encyclicals. John the 23rd only was Pope for 5 years, but he wrote 8. Paul VI wrote relatively few encyclicals. Between 63 and 78, a 15-year period, he only wrote 7. And John Paul II, by the year 1996, had written already 12. I think it's 16 or 17, the total encyclicals that John Paul II wrote. Now, an encyclical is important, well, not always. If you look at Leo the 13th, John and Pius the 10th and the 11th, not all the encyclicals have the same importance. Some of the encyclicals, you could talk about 3 types of encyclicals. There are encyclicals that are kind of exhortations that invite people to live the Christian life in a certain way. There are encyclicals that are doctrinal, that study a particular issue of church teaching and seek to understand it better and to clarify issues around it. And there are what we call social encyclicals. This started with Leo XIII, which deals specifically with issues about the Church's social teaching. Leo XIII, for example, was writing at a time where one of the questions was, do workers have the right to organize themselves? Remember, this is 1896. Do workers have the right to organize themselves into unions in order to strive for better working conditions and better salaries? And the Pope said, absolutely, absolutely, because these workers are gathering for the common good of the workers and their families. And since then, it's been a teaching in the Catholic Church that unions are good and that Catholics should support the work of unions, particularly where workers are being exploited and not treated fairly. So that was an issue, kind of a burning issue in 1896, and since then it's become part of the Church's teaching. So you see, encyclicals are places where popes can broaden or deepen the Church's teaching around certain issues. Now, mind you, not all encyclicals are as important as others, The encyclical where the Pope talks about the beauty of the Rosary is fine. It's a good encyclical, but it doesn't add anything to the Church's teaching. It's just an invitation to pray the Rosary, all right? So it doesn't develop the Church's teaching. You won't see it quoted many places. But the social encyclicals, the doctrinal encyclicals are quoted very, very often. Probably the most famous encyclical, modern encyclical, is Paul VI encyclical in 1968 called Humanae Vitae, on human life, in which the Pope broached the topic of the legitimacy of the use of artificial means of birth control. And it's very famous for, it's probably, let's be honest, the first encyclical that was raised such a controversy in the history of the Church, and still does today. Before then, I don't think there's an encyclical that kind of raised that kind of controversy, but that one certainly did. Maybe that's why Paul VI didn't write so many after that, but certainly that one was a very controversial one. John Paul II's encyclicals, he wrote at the beginning of his pontificate, he wrote 3 doctrinal encyclicals on the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, which are really beautiful texts to go back to. And he wrote those, remember, at the beginning of the 80s. And then when he came to the year 2000, in order to prepare the Jubilee of the year 2000, remember we had 3 years of preparation. What were the 3 years of preparation? The Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. So in a sense, you can see how already at the beginning of his pontificate, John Paul II was preparing the Jubilee, which would only arrive 20 years later. And then John Paul II wrote some very wonderful social encyclicals, particularly one on human work, Laborem Exercens, it's called, which is a wonderful meditation on the value of work and what work means. He also wrote one called The 100th Year, Centesimus Annus, in 1996, the 100th anniversary of the encyclical that Leo XVI had written, the first one called the Rerum Novarum on New Things. So 100 years after that, the Pope kind of updates the teaching that had started with Leo XIII. And he also wrote some very strong encyclicals on human Evangelium Vitae, the gospel of life, in which he spoke about issues such as abortion and euthanasia very clearly and very powerfully. Fides et ratio, on the relationship between faith and reason, which is a very complicated issue and a very important one to study. Now, what is the authority of an encyclical? Well, when a pope writes something in an encyclical, are you compelled as a Catholic to believe it? Well, what's important to remember is that not everything that the Pope says is said with the charism of infallibility. You know, some people, a lot of Catholics and a lot of non-Catholics believe that the dogma of the Pope's infallibility kind of says that the Pope cannot make a mistake ever whenever he talks. That's not what the dogma of infallibility says. The dogma of infallibility says that in certain situations, when the Pope specifies it, when he's talking about issues of faith or morals, he can teach infallibly. But popes have done it very, very rarely. John Paul II never evoked that charism of infallibility in his teachings. So there is no, John Paul II never said, I teach infallibly this or that. John Paul II never did. Neither did Paul VI, neither did John the 23rd. You have to go back to Pius XII with the declaration of the dogma of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin. So that's over 50 years ago. That was the last infallible teaching of a pope. But that doesn't mean that then whatever the Pope writes is just kind of an editorial piece that you can take or leave, you know? No, it means that the Pope's solemn teaching, you could say his official teaching, is part of what's called the ordinary magisterium in the Church. And we need to receive and to respect the ordinary magisterium of the Pope. So that the encyclicals are typically some of the most authoritative teaching that the Pope uses. So when the Pope writes in an encyclical, we need to be very attentive to what he's writing. Particularly, for example, when, like in Evangelium Vitae, John Paul II at a few places says, and so I teach authoritatively that the taking of innocent life is always an abhorrent and mortal sin. I mean, that's as close as you can get to infallibility without actually being an infallible teaching. You know, when he says, I teach with authority that. But this first encyclical of Benedict XVI is not that style. Benedict XVI's first encyclical, first of all, it seems that, well, it's clear the encyclical is in two parts. And the first part is more a meditation on love, and the second part is a reflection on the Church's charitable works. All right? So, well, it's linked because charity is one form of love. But you'll see when I present the two parts are quite different. And reading articles and background and everything, it seems that the second part of the encyclical was something that had been prepared already by a commission called Cor Unum in Rome. It's one of the departments of the Curia, which deals with the charitable works of the Church. And you can't be sure about this, but probably, you know, those who are responsible for that department, speaking with Pope John Paul II, you know, kind of shared with them that it might be good to have, you know, a text on the charitable work of the Church. And And possibly John Paul II would have said, well, start working on one, because the Pope rarely writes an encyclical all by himself. He usually has groups of people helping him, but he's the final author. So they would have started working on this part on charity. And you'll see in the second part that it's more, how can you say, objective, more organizational. The first part you feel is much more personal, and it seems the first part really was, Benedict's own work, that it's his reflection. And as a matter of fact, in the first part, you see a number of places where, he's quoting Marx, and he's quoting Nietzsche, and then he quotes a church father and Augustine, and then he goes back to Aristotle. You can see this as a theologian, a university professor who's kind of bringing in all his knowledge together. So you can tell that the first part really comes, I think, much closer, much more directly from Benedict XVI himself. But that doesn't take away from the fact that the whole encyclical is under his name, and so the whole text belongs to Benedict XVI. One final thing before we look at the text itself is that a lot of people pay close attention to the first encyclical that a pope writes, because they kind of see it as the Pope's mission statement, you could say. Here's his first chance to kind of write a long text that he sends to everybody, and they're saying it kind of sets the tone for the rest of his pontificate. And John Paul II, it was clear, because his first encyclical, which was on Christ, the Redeemer of humanity, I mean, that was the whole kind of point, and it never left. The whole papacy of John Paul II was to continually bring the church and the whole world back to Jesus Christ, to place Christ at the middle of our lives, in the middle of the whole activity of the church and of the whole, growth of the Christian and of the whole project of humanity, to put Christ back in the center and to say that it is in Christ that we find salvation and redemption. That was John Paul's papacy and his life. So that was clear. So people were looking at this first encyclical from Benedict XVI, saying he's going to kind of set the tone for the rest of his pontificate. What kind of tone will he set? So a lot of people were stunned when he decided to write a text on love. And you'll see as we read it, it's kind of good that we look at this the day after Valentine's Day. You'll see what I mean when we get into it. But it really is a beautiful meditation on love. So everybody's saying, oh my God, here's the man who's supposed to be the stern disciplinarian of the church, and here he is writing this beautiful text. And there's hardly any condemnation or negativity. Oh, he points out some problems, but it is a very beautiful and a very positive text. So we'll enter into the text. But before we do, are there any questions at this moment? Or yeah. Why does the Pope use his infallibility so rarely? I would say, how can I say? That's a good question, and I guess it could be debated. But I would say it's because it is the most solemn form of teaching. It is reserved for the most important issues sometimes. Well, some people would say, well, the Assumption of Mary wasn't the most important issue in the life of the church, but it was considered very, very important at that time. The other thing is that I think the Pope would not want to exercise his infallibility without feeling that he's in union with all the bishops of the world. As a matter of fact, Pius XII consulted all the bishops of the world before declaring the dogma of infallibility. So going through that process is a long process also. But I guess it's mostly because it is kind of the ultimate word, and it binds the church forever and ever after that. It's not just true for now, it's true forever once you've said it. So I think that's why maybe they don't use it very, very often. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? Ça va? Yeah. Are we ready to look into this text? Oh. Here Here I am. I have a problem. Does anybody have a little Band-Aid with them in their purse or something? A nurse. I need a nurse. Sister Pat. Yeah. We'll take a break for a moment there. No. I just need a little Band-Aid. Put this in my documentation for canonization, how the blood of the martyrs poured out. By the way, and seriously, I don't know if you know, but last week there's a priest in Pakistan who was killed. This young Muslim man walked into the church and just took a gun and shot him through the heart, crying, God bless Allah. And nobody understands why, because it seems that this young man was an ordinary young man, but with all the heated passions that are being stirred right now, people are going crazy, and he just went crazy, and oh yeah, well he thought he was, yeah, but in Rome, the Cardinal of Rome, said that when somebody dies, simply, it's clear that this priest was killed because he's Catholic, because he's a believer, that is a martyr, and so anyway, it's a very, very sad situation, but that's where we are. There are still martyrs today. Okay, so let's go into this text, and the first thing we want to do is I want to explain how the Pope starts, and this is the most important thing. He starts by reflecting on the difference of two Greek words that we translate into English by the word love. We only have the one word in English, love, which translates the word Eros and the word agape. We also use it to translate another word in Greek, which is philos, the verb philein, to love. Philos, though he just mentions it in passing, that's the word that is used in John's Gospel to speak about the love that binds brothers and sisters together in the faith. When you love, by the love you have for each other, they will know you're my disciples. Love one another as I have loved you. Philein, the love. And that love we would often translate as friendship. Philos, philos, we hear it in the word Philadelphia. Delphia means a city or a town. Philos, so the town of brotherly love, the town of friendship. That's what Philadelphia means. And philosophia is a friend of Sophia. Sophia is wisdom. So a friend of wisdom is a philosopher. And philology is somebody who's a friend of words, likes looking at words. Tolkien was a philologer. And a philatelist collects stamps. He's a friend of stamps. And I guess Philomena, whoever she is a friend of someone anyway. Mena's friend. In Luke's Gospel, it starts, my dear Theophilos, my dear Théophile, we say in French. Theophilos, which means friend of God. So friend. So philos is friendship. But the Pope is more interested in these two other words, Eros and agape. And let's start with Eros. And just obviously, the word that we get in English from Eros is erotic. And so we think of erotic as being pornographic. And so we see this as, this is awful stuff, right? And that's wrong. It's wrong to understand Eros that way or to reduce it to simply the pornographic. Eros is, in Greek, designates more a passion. That's what it designates, a passion. The passionate love that you can experience for someone or for something, The passion you can have for sport right now during the Olympics, Some people are passionate about sport. That's Eros. Some people are passionate about music. That's Eros. Some people are passionate about cars. That's Eros. All of that. Some people are passionate about nature. That's Eros. Anything that is passion, anything that is kind of filled with emotion, that is charged, that is dynamic, that's Eros. And of course, in a relationship with a person, it's when you're passionate about someone. That's what, kind of St. Valentine's Day celebrates, is kind of this passionate love that you have for someone, huh? You're kind of awakened by it. I always tell, I remember high school students when I was teaching who'd come up to me and say, "Oh, sir, I met this girl, and I can't eat anymore. My stomach's all upside down, and I can't sleep at night, and I get all sweaty, I think it's love." Well, it's a form of love. It's Eros. It's Eros. And in our world, that's the kind of love that is celebrated, that is talked about, that is sung about in music, that is shown on films, that is written about in novels. That's what it's all about, right? About this kind of very powerful, passionate love. So that's one word. But what the Pope says is that one of the novelties in Christianity, in the Christian Bible, is that when they speak of love, they do not use that word at all in the New Testament. They use the word agape. And agape is a love which is, its characteristic, it's not its passion or its emotion. Its characteristic is its self-giving. It's self-giving. How can I say, this is my definition, this is not the Pope's definition, but agape is when the other's happiness is more important than your own. Or, to put it in a better way, where your happiness is bound up with the other's happiness. And so you focus completely on the other's happiness. See, in Eros, what happens, what are you focused on? You're focused on the feelings that are within you, the emotions that are awakened within you, the passion that the other person awakens within you. Whereas agape, you're not focused on yourself, you're focused on the other. All right? Now, one of the things that the Pope says is at the end of number 3. He says some people have said, and here's where he quotes Nietzsche. He says that Nietzsche criticizes the Church for having kind of made an opposition between agape and Eros, and having killed Eros, having killed passion. And at the beginning of number 4, no, I need an English one. Can I borrow an English one there? At the beginning of number 4, he answers, and this is quite remarkable. I must admit that when I read this, I kind of blinked twice and I reread it again. Is this the case? Did Christianity really destroy Eros? And so, he says, well, let's take... I'm sorry, that's not... It's a bit later where it kind of surprised me. But here he says, okay, let's take a look at it. And he speaks about Eros. And he speaks about how the Greeks saw Eros as a kind of intoxication. But the next paragraph, he shows how the Old Testament opposed this. Because the Greeks practically elevated Eros to a kind of god. There is a god called Eros. And the Greeks had Aphrodite, the feminine version of that erotic love, and the Romans had Venus. But he says the Old Testament is against this, not because they reject Eros, but because the Old Testament declared war on a warped and destructive form of it. Because the counterfeit of divinization of Eros actually strips it of its dignity and dehumanizes it. What is the Pope trying to say here? He's trying to say that when we make of Eros, of this passion, our God, when we make of it the meaning of our lives, the end-all and the be-all, we are reducing ourselves to passion. We are reducing ourselves to emotions and to feelings. And that is not fully human. On the contrary, that is becoming more animal than human. So he's saying what the Old Testament is kind of fighting against is this tendency to make absolute this value of passion and of romance and of emotions. And we see it in our world today, where some people, that's the only thing they're looking for, is kind of these strong, powerful emotions, and they go from one person to another, from one relationship to another, because typically these strong feelings, they don't last, you know. They last for a little while, but then they kind of pass away, and then you're bored. And then you meet somebody else who awakens those feelings, so you leave that one, you go with that one. And eventually you become a slave to your search for these strong feelings. So what does he say? Number 5, the second paragraph. We have to realize, first and foremost, that the man is a being made up both of body and soul. Man is truly himself when his body and his soul are intimately united. The challenge of Eros can be said to be truly overcome when this unification is achieved, when the two are united. And a bit lower, if you look, if you're following me at the bottom of page 8, that bottom paragraph. Nowadays, Christianity of the past is often criticized as having been opposed to the body. And it is quite true that tendencies of this sort have always existed. This is where it surprised me, you know. He says there have been, how does he say it, criticism that Christianity is opposed to the body. And he says it's true. Tendencies of this sort have always existed. And that's a legitimate criticism. Yet, he says the contemporary way of exalting the body is deceptive. Eros, when it is reduced to pure sex, becomes a commodity, a mere thing to be bought and sold. Or rather, the human person becomes a commodity. So Eros, reduced to itself, is a dehumanizing kind of love. And what needs to be done then, and this is where in number 6 he says, what needs to be done is that Eros has to be transformed slowly by agape. He says at the bottom of the last paragraph at the bottom of 7, it is part of love's growth towards higher ideals and inward purification that it now seeks to become definitive, and to do so in a twofold sense, in the sense of exclusivity and in the sense of being forever. He's saying what has to happen is that Eros, that kind of romantic, passionate love, has to be transformed. First, it has to be transformed by a love that focuses on the other person and stops looking for just the feelings, becomes centered on the person. And secondly, has to be a long-term kind of love. So this is where agape steps in. Agape comes and purifies Eros. It helps Eros become long-term. It helps Eros become centered on the relationship rather than on the feelings. And this truly becomes humanizing. And I skip and I go to number 8. And this is where it's wonderful. He speaks about, number 10, that God's love for humanity, he says, is a passionate love. God's love for humanity, God is passionately in love with us. So we can speak about God's Eros for us. I've never heard a pope speak about God's Eros for us. That God has somehow an erotic love in the deep sense of the word, not pornographic, but in the sense of passionate, powerful, nearly an emotional love for us. We have seen that God's Eros for man, though, is totally agape. It's a passionate love, but that is totally focused on us and on our happiness. That's what God is about. That's what God wants to find in us. And how do we find this? He says it's in Jesus. And what he says at number 12, this is really wonderful. He says, in Jesus we discover the real novelty of the New Testament lies not so much in new ideas as in the figure of Christ himself, who gives flesh and blood to the concepts of the Old Testament. See, here the Pope overcomes something. You know, when I was growing up, I was taught, well, the Old Testament is the wrathful God, the God of vengeance, the God of anger, and the New Testament is the God of love. You've heard that before? Well, the Pope says that's not true. That's not true. In the Old Testament already we are discovering a God of love and of passionate love, and a God who gives himself, a God who cares for His creation, and we see it in a number of prophets. This is very clear. So what is new in the New Testament is not the teaching about who God is. It's not a new teaching. He says it's a new way of coming to know the truth of that, because the teaching becomes incarnate in a person. Now it's not just things we say about God, it's things we experience when we meet the person, Jesus Christ. The love of God for us takes on a face, and that face is the face of Jesus. In Jesus, we encounter the passionate love of God, Eros, which has been totally focused on us, agape. And we are called to live the same thing. And we go quickly here because number 13, he touches on how the Eucharist helps us to discover that. Because in the Eucharist, what happens, Jesus gives himself for us. His love becomes a total self-offering for us. And that is agape. To die to yourself in order to make the other one live, that is agape. That is where love has become really purified, and love becomes the greatest. Now, number 16, and this is the end of the first section, he asks himself this question then, can somebody be forced to love? Huh? And the answer to that is, well, no. You can't be forced to love. So how can Jesus give us a commandment? You will love, your brother and sister, your neighbor. How can Jesus tell us you will love? Can you force yourself to love someone? And he says, no, you can't. But what happens is that the more you enter into identification with God, the more you enter into God's love for you, the more you are transformed, the more you start seeing the other with God's eyes. The more you start relating to the other the way God relates to the other. And how does God relate to the other? In love. And so that's how slowly love is transformed. It is no longer a commandment. It becomes a union with God that expresses itself in our love for others. And this is really wonderful. Where does he say this? At the top of page 19. Pardon? Oh, you're number 17. Sorry, you've got your number 17. We're looking at the end of the first paragraph. He has loved us first, and he continues to do so. We then can respond with love. God does not demand of us a feeling which we ourselves are incapable of producing. He loves us. He makes us see and experience his love. And since he has loved us first, then love can blossom as a response within us. It's not a question of trying to produce some emotion, of meeting somebody on the street and saying, oh, I got to love this person. Okay, so how am I going to force myself to feel love for this person? No, that's not what it's about. What it is entering into communion with God and being able to see this person as God sees that person. And since God loves this person, I enter into God's love for this person. I often speak about that in forgiveness, for example, because sometimes it's just so hard to forgive someone. And sometimes it's impossible for us to forgive. Then in our prayer we say, God, you forgive them. And I'll kind of go along with you. In a sense, what you do is you enter into God's forgiveness for the person. Well, it's the same way you enter into God's love for the person. And I love what the Pope says after that, the second paragraph of number 17. In the gradual enfolding of this encounter, it is clearly revealed that love is not merely a sentiment. Sentiments come and go. A sentiment can be a marvelous first spark, but it is not the fullness of love. Earlier we spoke of the process of purification, maturation, by which Eros comes fully into its own, becomes love in the full meaning of the word. It is a characteristic of mature love that it calls into play all of man's potentialities. It engages the whole man, so to speak. Contact with the visible manifestations of God's love can awaken within us a feeling of joy born of the experience of being loved. But this encounter engages our will and our intellect. Acknowledgement of the living God is one path towards love, and the yes of our will to his will unites our intellect, our will, and our sentiments in the all-embracing act of love. This process is always open-ended. Love is never finished and complete. Throughout life it changes, it matures, and that is how it remains faithful to itself. And just a bit further, at number 18, love of neighbor is thus shown to be possible in the way proclaimed by Jesus. It consists in the very fact that in God and with God, I love even the person whom I do not like or even know. I love the person whom I do not like or even know because I do it in God. This can only take place on the basis of an intimate encounter with God, an encounter which has become a communion of will, even affecting my feelings. Then I learn to look on this other person not simply with my eyes and my feelings, but from the perspective of Jesus Christ. His friend becomes my friend. And just a bit further in English, where does it say? Just towards the end. So then it is no longer a question of a commandment imposed from without and calling for the impossible, but rather of a freely bestowed experience of love from within, a love which by its very nature must then be shared with others. Love grows through love. Now, I think that kind of sums up that whole first part. Love grows through love. Our love for others grows through our experience of being loved by God. Not bad for a 79-year-old bachelor, huh? That was one author's comment on that, on the text, Not bad for a 79-year-old bachelor. And I particularly like, where he speaks about that. And I think this is something that we could, talk about with our young people a lot, that emotions are the spark, and you can start with emotions, but that cannot last. It can be the spark which awakens a relationship, but that spark needs to be transformed. I often speak about the difference between the river at the beginning, which is a rustling brook, and you see all its splashes and it gurgles and it shoots up in the air, and the difference between that and a deep stream, a deep river, which just flows very deeply. And the river at the surface is so much calmer, but it flows with so much more power. Well, Eros is that passionate, bubbly, sparkling, exciting kind of love that needs, in order to grow, to become that deep, powerful river, which maybe doesn't splash about as much, but certainly gives life much more to others around it. Does the passionate love, what the Pope is saying, and I skipped over the part she's asking, in marriage, can that passionate love come back, What the Pope is saying is that, and he says, and I skipped over those numbers, but you can go back and read it now that you understand the difference between Eros and agape and the relationship between the two. The Pope says that Eros without agape is dehumanizing, but he says agape without Eros is inhuman. That's very important what I just said, that agape without Eros is inhuman. The trying to love someone without feeling, a kind of a purely intellectual exercise, is not human. He says in order to be real, the agape, the seeking the other's happiness, has to be based on a passion, a caring. But the passion changes. It becomes a different kind of passion. It becomes maybe a passion of caring, a passion of being there for the other. But it certainly changes. At least that's what I hear from talking with married couples, I'm not a 79-year-old bachelor, but I am a bachelor. You keep on looking for that passion to come back, yeah. But I think it has to be nourished. And it has to become part of the relationship. Well, married couples can talk about this better. How does that change? Does anybody have something to say about that? How that romance changes through the years?
I spoke to my priest about it, and he said that you have to show more interest
Oh, if you have to express that love, huh? Show the interest, more interest, of love for the other. For anybody else who's been an old married couple here has got, what do you have to say to that? Yes. And I think that's what the Pope is saying. You have to have both. You have to have both, particularly in marriage. But even the Pope says, just doing charity work, you have to care for the person who's in front of you. He says at one point, he quotes Paul. I think it's a bit later, actually. It's a bit later in the second part, and we'll see it. But he quotes Paul. He says, if I give everything I away, but I have no love, then I am nothing. I can be very charitable, but if I don't care. And I think that care is the manifestation of Eros, a passion for the other human being. Not sexual, but passionate. That I feel for that other person, It can be sympathy. It can be... I think it's evoked, for example, when you see somebody suffering and, even on TV or even in a movie, and you start finding that you're crying in front of the suffering of someone that you don't know. That's Eros. See, that's a passion. That's a feeling. It's not just kind of a cold intellectual love. Oh, I love this person. I care for them. No, there's something there. And I think in the marriage relationship, it has to be there. Yeah. Okay, so that in civilizations where there's an arranged marriage, it's agape first and eros after. Yeah. Though it would be interesting to discuss with people who are in that relationship. I would suggest that it's philos first. You kind of have to become the other person's friend first. And then out of the friendship can grow possibly this passionate love. The Pope would suggest that agape is actually the end of the maturing process of love, and we never have attained it. But it'd be interesting to talk with someone. I'll have to talk with Sultan Jess about that. I don't know if you know Sultan, but one of the reporters. I mean, his marriage was arranged by his parents. So he met his bride, and their relationship grew, into a very romantic relationship. He was telling me, but it didn't start there. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
I think as in children.
Yes.
And then watching your children raise children.
Yes. So that the passion is less superficial and deeper, is what you're saying, as it matures. And basically, and less volatile. And what's happening is that agape is entering into the eros there. That's what's happening, I think. And it makes me think of the difference between, fun and joy. I was doing this with grade 9 students. What's the difference between pleasure? I said, what's the difference between pleasure and joy with grade 9 students? And they're the ones that told me, well, pleasure is kind of superficial. Joy is deeper. Pleasure lasts a moment. Joy lasts longer. See, so what is happening is that pleasure is transformed into joy. Joy is deeper. It's less superficial, less, you're joyful. You're not going, but you're joyful. Joy is quieter. So the passion is there, but it's a quieter passion because it's a deeper one. Yeah. Okay. So if you don't mind, I'd just like to move to the second part of it. So after this first part, which is a reflection on what is love, because that's the question, what is love? Then he comes to the practice of love. And the practice of love in the church he calls caritas, charity. Now I would like to point out that, let me see here, number 26. One of the things, I must admit, if I have a little criticism about the encyclical, if I could change one little thing about the encyclical, I would use a word that John Paul II coined and used a lot, and that word is solidarity. Solidarity. And solidarity is the church kind of being aware and sensitive to the needs of the world. And that, I think the most beautiful expression of that in any document in the church is the beginning of one of the documents of the Second Vatican Council. The Second Vatican Council produced 16 documents. One of the documents was called The Church in the Modern World. And the title of it is Gaudium et Spes, which is the joys and the hopes. And it starts something like this. I don't know it by heart, but the joys and the hopes, the anxieties and the worries of the world are the joys and the hopes, the anxieties and the worries of the church. Because nothing which is human is estranged from the Christian. Huh? That's a beautiful expression. So that the joys and the hopes, the anxieties, the worries of people who are not Christian, of the whole world, they are also our joys and our worries because we are not separate from them. You know, we are not separate. Because you're a Christian, you don't, all of a sudden you don't care about the world. No, you care about all these people. And what's going on in the world affects us, and we are very preoccupied by it. And as a church, we need to respond to that because the church is set into the world to respond to that. Jesus came into the world to launch a mission, and he gave that mission to his church to go. And how do we respond to it? We respond, the Pope said we respond to it. John Paul II would speak about evangelization. We need to bring them the good news. And we also need to bring them witness of our holiness to build a civilization of love. And third, solidarity. And what is solidarity? Solidarity is the work of our care for others, and there are two components to that. And here's where Benedict XVI speaks about these two components at number 26, and he names those two components, which are justice and charity. Justice and charity. Those are the two components of solidarity. What is the difference between justice and charity? And here I'm going to use my words. I'm not going to use the Pope's words. But I think by explaining it, then you'll be able to go back to the text and understand it more clearly. But, you know, when I see something going on that's wrong, you know, somebody's suffering, okay, somebody's suffering, I can focus on the actual suffering and try to alleviate the suffering. Or I can focus on the cause of the suffering and try to fix the cause. All right? You understand that? So, for example, up in Northern Ontario, in Sudbury, the Sisters of Charity of Ottawa, they opened an orphanage there in the 1930s. Why did they open an orphanage? Because a lot of men who were working in the mines were getting killed. Because it's very dangerous. So a lot of men were dying. And they were leaving big families behind with, you know, a woman who's alone, couldn't take care of all these children. And so an orphanage is open to take in these children and care for them. Here's a situation of suffering. You see the suffering of these families. We will care for them. But what's causing the number of orphans? What's causing it? The unsafe conditions in the mines. So let's do something about the unsafe conditions in the mines. That is justice. That is working for justice. Taking care of the orphans is charity. You see the difference between the two? Taking care of the suffering of the person, that is charity. Trying to change the cause, that is justice. And the Pope says we have to do both. We have to do both. Now, there's a passage here where he speaks about Karl Marx. You know Karl Marx. Karl Marx was a German who lived in England, who saw the unjust conditions that a lot of people worked under. Right now I'm reading a book called The Victorians, and it explains the life condition of people living in England in the 19th century, in the middle of the Industrial Revolution, and, you know, children, you know, 6-year-old, 7-year-old children being forced to spend 12 hours a day working in the most unhealthy conditions. It's incredible when you read about it. And some parliamentarians trying to bring rules to change that, to limit, say they can only work 10 hours. And some parliamentarians getting up and saying, well, you're stopping them from making more money. It's just awful when you think about it, huh? But the conditions the great poverty and the great exploitation of workers in England was remarkable. And Marx was trying to respond to that. And his way of responding to it was developing this theory that there is a fight between the classes, between the working class and the ownership class, and that there's going to have to be a revolution where the working class takes ownership by taking it out of the hands of the owners. So he developed his whole theory that developed into Marxism, right? Well, Marx said that as long as we keep on organizing orphanages, then we won't worry about the causes. You know, as long as we keep on treating the symptoms, we won't worry about the causes. So Marx said, we're treating all these symptoms is just a way of keeping the system in place. You know, these rich people who give money to open orphanages, of course they're going to do that. It'll keep all the poor people quiet, you know, and aren't they good? Look at these rich people, you know, they're giving us money for or our orphanages, and you won't change the system, which Marx was saying is unjust. So Marx was saying we shouldn't do charity, because doing charity just perpetuates an unjust system. Well, the Pope responds to that in his letter. He says that doesn't make sense. We have to work for justice, but we don't work for justice by stopping to do charity. You don't change a system by making the suffering of people get even worse. All right? So he says we need to do both. And Marx's analysis is a wrong analysis. He says we have to strive both for justice and for charity. We need to change the causes, and we need to care for people. Now, the Pope makes an interesting point here. And it's a point that is debatable. I've been talking with some people, and some people are saying, I'm not sure about that. We will have to talk with the Pope next time. But the Pope suggests that the work of justice is the works of Catholics involved in politics. The work of justice, this is the mission of Catholics involved in politics, because how can we change the system is through political action. And it is government that has the responsibility of changing the situations that cause injustice, that cause suffering. So he says Catholics must get involved in politics in order to work for justice. But it is not the Church's role to build that just world. He says it's the political world to do it, and the Church has to kind of be the conscience of government, and Catholics themselves, individual members of the Church, have to be involved in this process. On the other hand, charity is the work of the Church. He says this is really the work of the Church. The Church must be involved in charity directly. And he says, why? Because the Church can bring to people what governments cannot bring. And what is that? It is love. That's what charity is, love. He says, see, what he's kind of saying is that, you know, you can have, for example, a government that sets up a welfare system to take care of the poor, but the problem is that, you know, the person who's on the other side of the board writing out your check and giving you your check because you're living in poverty doesn't necessarily care for you. And what the Pope is saying is that that person needs more than money. That person needs love. That person needs to be looked at with compassion and with tenderness, and they have to feel that they count like someone. And he says it's the only way that generosity can be not humiliating. See, generosity can be very humiliating, huh? Some people refuse to go, for example, to the Agape Center here in town because they're too humiliated to go, you know, take something for free. Even though they need it, and even though they're having difficulties making ends meet, they don't want to go because it's humiliating. Well, the Pope is saying the only way generosity can overcome that humiliating aspect is that the person who's being generous is doing it out of love. That person is seeing the person who's receiving the charity as a human being, an equal son of God or daughter of God, my brother, my sister. And he says this no government can do. no government can do. So he's saying this is why the church has to be involved in works of charity. Because in doing works of charity, we are manifesting God's love, care, and compassion directly to the person. So this whole second part is an interesting, very interesting. I've never seen this in a church document before, this kind of reflection on justice and charity, but justice being the work of government, charity being one of the responsibilities of the church. And the church influences the governments in two ways, by being the conscience of the government through its teaching, and by the presence of Catholics, individual Catholics who are involved in politics, involved in working for justice. That's essential. It says, but on the other hand, we cannot abandon the works of charity. And here he has some comments about the various works of charity that are organized in the church, national, diocesan. Starting at number 30, he speaks about the multiple structures of charitable service in the social context of the present day. And he speaks about organizations. For example, Development and Peace here in Canada is one of the charitable organizations that also works for justice, but is closely allied to the people who are frontline workers in the third world. So, for example, at number 32, we turn our attention once again to those who are responsible for carrying out the church's charitable activity. As our preceding reflections have made clear, the true subject of the various Catholic organizations that carry out a ministry of charity is the church herself, at all levels, from the parishes, through the dioceses, through the universal church. This is why it was most opportune that my venerable predecessor, Paul VI, established the Pontifical Council Cor Unum as the agency of the Holy See responsible for orienting and coordinating the organizations and charitable activities promoted by the Catholic Church. And here he speaks about then, the responsibility of different groups towards organizing the Church's charitable work in the midst of the world. And at the end, then, he has a short reflection on the saints as that face of charity for the world, and of Mary in particular. And he finishes with a beautiful prayer. Holy Mary, Mother of God, you have given the world its true light, Jesus, your Son, the Son of God. You abandoned yourself completely to God's call, and thus became a wellspring of the goodness which flows forth from him. Show us Jesus, lead us to him, teach us to know and love him, so that we too can become capable of true love and be fountains of living world in the midst of a thirsting world. And that's how he ends the encyclical. So that kind of gives you a quick overview of this beautiful, beautiful encyclical. And I suggest that it's 10 after right now, so 5 minutes to just stand up, stretch. I'm going to ask you a favor. You got to help me, okay? It's been pointed out to me that I've developed a bit of a nervous tic. I kind of go like this with my hair all the time. And I caught myself doing it tonight, but I don't realize it, So to help me, whenever I do that, you want to all raise your hand? And I'll learn to stop pretty quick, okay? So we would get into ruts and we don't even realize it, huh? So, yeah, well, it could be a lot worse. But I just like to get rid of that one. Yeah. At least I'm not going. I have to tell you just a funny little story. I remember going in with a grade 8 class. And I was explaining to them all the symbolism in the celebration of the Eucharist. And we did before. And during the Mass, as we were going on, I also explained more of the symbols. And at the end, I said, if you have any questions about any of the symbols, just, keep them in mind. And at the end, we'll go over them. So at the end of Mass, one little kid raises his hand. And I said, yeah. He says, what does it mean when you go like this? You see that? I said, that doesn't mean anything. That's Since then, I stopped doing it when I'm presiding. We don't realize it. Okay. Any questions or any comments about the encyclical? It's just a little free time of sharing. My talk will make it easier to read. I have to say, most encyclicals, any church document really, I remember when I was 16 years old, somebody gave me the documents of Vatican II. Here, this is a wonderful text. Was a good spiritual person who wanted me to grow in my faith. I started reading this. I didn't understand a single thing that was being said until I got to university, and in more than one theology class, we would study the texts. And in studying the text, what the teachers would do is give us the context, give us the main ideas, what the thrust was, and then all of a sudden you read it and you say, oh, okay. And I think that's what's needed. Whenever we approach a text that has been written within the church, in any organization that specializes in something. But hopefully, I hope this will help you to read the text for yourselves now and kind of take it to heart. One of the advantages of this encyclical is that it's short. It's very short compared to the encyclicals of John Paul II. When I received it, when I got it, I was asked if I would give an interview about it with with La Presse in Montreal. And I said, I don't know if I'll have time. They wanted to do the interview that afternoon. Will I have time to read it all? Well, I sat down in an hour, I'd read it. And that really, really surprised me. So it is short, so it makes it easier that way. Yeah. Yes? 2 points on this, and during the break we had a good discussion. When we say that, when the Pope speaks about Catholics being involved in politics, it's not just in political parties. He's talking about any political action, any social action, social activism. So a lot of the work that we can do is outside of political parties. And in that sense, we have a lot of work to do. And we can get involved in that. But at the same time, the political parties are those that have power, and it's important that we do have Catholics who are convinced and committed, who are there, who are pushing, and who are reminding and are working and do not give up just because they don't win all the battles or they don't get all the policies the way they wish they were. We have to be there. We cannot afford to just wash our hands of it and walk away and say there's nothing we can do. I think it's important that we do get Catholics, very committed Catholics, involved. Like you're right, not just any Catholic, but Catholics who take to heart their own faith. But there are some, and I know some personally who are involved and very they're there with their faith convictions in the midst of a very imperfect system. They're trying to do their best to make it work, and I think I think one of the problems is as Catholics we've never really encouraged good Catholics to be involved in politics. We've never held it up as an ideal, held it up as a vocation, celebrated it. We kind of go along with the flow and talk about, politicians being crooked and everything. And I think what we need to do is we need to start seeing that, no, this is a worthwhile endeavor, and we do need to have good Catholics involved in politics, and we need to encourage them and support them. That's one thing I think we could. So what you're talking about here, when you say it's hard for an individual to do something against big money, that's why often it's more consoling to work in charity, because at least in charity you feel you're doing something. You're trying to change the system is just so hard, and you don't see the results of it. So it's a lot easier to work in charity, to go to Agape Center and say, I'll help, prepare the meals, and I can give food to people who are hungry. And so we have to do that. But the Pope makes the point that we should not be discouraged. We have to remember that God is active and the Spirit is blowing. And so if we remember that the work for justice is the work of God, then we will not be discouraged by the immensity of the task or by the fact that it seems the results are not evident, So, yes, it's easy to say, oh, my God, look, big money, and how are we going to change the system and everything? But at the same time, there are things that are changing. There are things that are different. I look at, for example, in the year 2000, the forgiveness of debt to third world countries became a reality for many of those countries. That was a huge, huge step forward. And that went against big money, but it's because ordinary people started getting on board and working for it. That's why I think an organization like CCODP, the Canadian Catholic Organization for Development and Peace, is a really worthwhile organization because it's a specific way that we as Catholics can try to have an impact on those systems, And at the same time, somebody mentioned, well, like the St. Vincent de Paul Society, that's another example of Catholics being involved, but they're very much on the charity aspect, reaching out and trying to help the person who's suffering right here and right now. By the way, I just like to share with you, yesterday I was involved in a lunch. The mayor invited me and a few other people to gather with him to talk about the social needs here in Cornwall. The people who are falling through the cracks, and there's going to be more with the closing of Domtar and possibly other companies. So how can we better respond to those needs? Well, see, here's one man who, out of his Christian convictions, because it really is there, is saying, how can we change a situation here that is threatening us? And he got a few people together, and we threw out some ideas, and now there's starting to be a little plan of action that's going. So here's a few people who are making an impact, changing situations. So I think it's important that we not give up. But it's true, you're struggling against a huge power structure, which is the power structure of international conglomerates and big money, and it really is hard to change those systems. There's no doubt about it. Yeah. You mean here in Cornwall? That was one of the things we were talking about yesterday. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. That's what we were talking about yesterday. We were talking about the poor and the working poor. We were talking about people who are struggling to make ends meet, and they have jobs that do not pay much, and they're working very hard, but they still can't make it. So, yes, we were talking about that yesterday. So, hopefully, the process that we launched yesterday will be able to, I don't want to go into it too much because it's still very, very much up in the air, but we've got some concrete steps to move forward to answering some of those issues. All I'm giving it is an example of saying, here's one person who gathers a few people and say, let's do something together, and I think it will produce results. Yeah. Yeah. There are certainly problems for people who are working and are poor at the same time. There's a different set of problems there that we as a society have not kind of met yet. And so certainly we have to identify what those problems are, and we have to start, I think that's one of the things we need to do, is start identifying what are the problems that you have and how can we, when you have a job that's paying minimum wage and there are no health benefits and there are no guarantees and there are no, personal days that you can take off when your kid is sick, those are the issues that we need to tackle. Yeah, very much so. Yeah. Yeah. So there are some issues you're bringing out that there are some safeguards, that are in the law, but it's obvious that there are specific problems that we need to look at, and I think we have to continue doing that. Now, what's interesting, just to point out to you, that in the Encyclical, the Pope points out that there are kind of three things the Church needs to do for the world, and we have to reach out to the world to bring them the good news. We have to reach out to the world with the witness of our lives, and we have to reach out to the world in solidarity. Those are the three aspects that we're building our parish leadership teams on, right? With stewardship as being the fourth one that allows all this to happen. But the whole notion of catechesis and evangelization, which is the Word of God, communion and solidarity, which is the love we have for each other and that goes out to the world, and liturgy and holiness, which is, the life of the sacraments, which allows us to live a life of holiness in the midst of the world, corresponds to what the Pope is talking about. And in the Parish Alive project that we're doing, like this first semester, we're focusing on, one of those four, which is stewardship. Our faith is our treasure, and we need to take care of that treasure. But during the next 3 seasons, we'll be looking at each one of those, and one of those will be looking at the question of solidarity. So how can we, as a church, reach out in justice and in charity to bring God's love to others? So it's exactly what the Pope is talking about. So we'll be working on that too. Huh? Kim, one final question. There's been, let's say that I've spoken with a few people who are Catholics who are involved in justice issues, and they're saying, well, when the Pope is saying it's not the Church's job, but Catholics should be involved in it, what does that mean? You know, like they're just kind of, they feel this issue needs to be explored and needs to be kind of examined closely, because it's not clear. It's not clear. You know, when the Pope says it's not the Church's job to organize a just world, but Catholics should be involved in it. Well, if Catholics are involved in it, isn't that the Church? You know, so let's just say that you know, there's a feeling that needs to be discussed and it needs to be studied, because it's kind of, this happens in the Church. When the Pope throws out a new idea, he kind of throws it out, and then theologians take it and start saying, okay, what does this mean, and how does this apply? And slowly, you know, it becomes kind of a seed that bears more fruit. And I think that's what I meant by that. Is that all right? It's not a question of grumbling. Yeah, it's not a question of grumbling. It's a question of saying that issue isn't very clear. In the Encyclical there, that's a new idea, and it raises a whole bunch of questions, and the Encyclical doesn't answer those questions. So we're going to need to continue studying that. The relationship, we'll need to continue studying the relationship between justice and charity, between politics, Catholics, Church. That needs to continue to be studied. It's a big issue, you know. If I can, I don't want to extend too much, but for example, there was the last time that a bill was brought in before the Canadian Parliament to limit the number of abortions. It was brought in by the Mulroney government. Now, it was voted down. At that time, there was no clear position as far as Rome went on whether we could support legislation that allowed abortions in some situations, but not in others, you know. Are you allowed to support a law that is less than perfect? There was no clear teaching on that. In his encyclical, which came out later, Evangelium Vitae, the Pope says, yes, if you cannot get a perfect law, it's allowable to support an imperfect law as long as it's clear that as long as you make it clear that you consider it an imperfect law and that you're going to keep on working for a more perfect law, you know. But at that time, when that law was brought in, that wasn't clear, so a lot of very good Catholics felt it couldn't be supported in conscience, and so people voted against it. And so now we have no law whatsoever on abortion, and now we're at the position where no party wants to touch it with a 10-foot pole, you know. Whereas if we had an imperfect law, at least maybe we'd be limiting the number. But those issues, I'm just bringing that out in terms of, that was an issue that was not clear, and the Pope in his teaching started bringing that. But it's still not clear. When can you support a law? When can you not support a law? What are the conditions and everything? These are issues that are new for us. How do we, as a church, situate ourselves in front of a pluralistic society, you know, where people are don't all agree? And how can a Catholic be involved in politics? For example, how can I be part of a, you know, all the major parties now are saying we're not going to talk about abortion. So as a Catholic, how do I get involved with a major party? Those are all issues that there's no clear answer on that. And I think it's going to take a lot of time, a lot of experience, and a lot of discussion as we move forward in trying to see how do we as Catholics live in a world that is so different than what it used to be. Monsignor? Well, no, I think the consensus among the bishops is that a lot of Catholics a lot of Catholics are more influenced by society in Canada than by the teaching of the Church. That too many Catholics are just going along with the flow. It could very well be. The problem is speaking out isn't enough anymore in today's world. People do not believe something simply because you tell them. That doesn't work anymore. So it's not enough that we tell them. We have to help them understand. And so that's a question of faith education. And that's the real challenge. Yeah. Yeah, so you're bringing up, and this is going way beyond the topic that we have to now, but you're bringing up the problem of how, as a church, do we influence, the structures and the political systems that we're in a world that is becoming more and more pluralistic, and in one in which a lot of Catholics in name do not agree with the teaching of the Church. And so how do we move forward on that? That's a huge, huge challenge. It's not one we're going to solve tonight, but it's one that we need to continue working on. Yeah, but admonishing the sinners, that's still in vogue. The problem is that when the person does not, but the problem here is that our models are models where people reacted to admonishment, and models where people respected teachings of authority, so that if, the authority said something, you said, oh, okay. That doesn't work today. What needs to be done more is helping people to understand, explaining things, seeking with them the deeper understanding. I remember writing a long letter to a teenager, to a university student, about the question of gay marriage, and which he just kind of rejected the Church's teaching, and boom, 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 boom. So I sat down, and I took each of his arguments, and I explained how the Church was approaching it and how he didn't understand what the Church was teaching. And at the end of it, he wrote me back and said, well, I realized that I was very, very mistaken in my understanding of the Church's teaching. He says, I don't necessarily go along with it, but I respect it a lot more. You see, that's a big move. From moving to a point where I'm condemning the Church's teaching to one where I'm starting to understand and to respect it, that's a move of education, But I think that's what we need to do, all of us as Catholics. Yeah. Yeah. The church leadership you're talking about? The church leadership in Canada I can tell you, the bishops of Canada did everything they could. I can tell you the meetings we had, the energies we had, the pressures that were put on the government, secret meetings that were held at very high levels between bishops and leaders of parties. There was a lot, immense work done by the bishops. But it didn't work, What can you say? Yeah, well, not just Bishop Henry. I can tell you all the bishops, Bishop Cardinal Ouellet went and spoke on behalf of the bishops. He was ridiculed, So a lot of leadership. Yeah. Yeah, that's what I mean by education or formation. There's a huge problem, lack of education, lack of formation. Well, one of the things we're going to work on during our 2-year project of Parish Alive, one of the areas is going to be evangelization, catechesis. So how do we help people to grow in their faith? How do we grow in our faith ourselves? How do we help others grow in their faith and understanding? Those are the issues we're going to be looking at. And our time is really running behind. These are excellent questions. It's remarkable how, starting from an encyclical, we open to all sorts of other questions. How that have to do with the life of the Church and the challenges that are before us. So let's hold all those people together in our prayers. And I thank you very much. And I hope it gives you the appetite to go and, read the encyclical. And you didn't lift your hands all together, so I must have been okay. Thank you. Have a good evening.